Good morning, folks. It's really great to see so many of you virtually online this morning to learn about a topic that is really relevant to districts and certainly timely. Some of you had questions, and we are really lucky to have Patrick Teague with us again. Many of you might have met him at annual meeting. He joined us last year for a virtual training opportunity too. The virtual training opportunities in the past are online on our training resource library, just like today's will be. But today I'm hoping you really take advantage of his insights and knowledge on FLSA and the upcoming changes to it. Before I pass things over, because I see some folks are still admitting into the wait room, I want to make sure we get as many people to hear Patrick as possible. A couple housekeeping items. If you joined us today, there's a handful of trainings that are coming up that might be of interest to you. First and foremost, I want to make sure you realize certainly this is open to anybody, but we found most relevance to some of our admin ops folks. Those join our committee meeting often. So I want to make sure you know that Kathleen Sullivan, who was on camera for us, as well as Susie Brown, are your admin ops committee chairs for Soil and Water Districts. So just like Shannon and myself, reach out to either of them with questions, guidance, direction, topics that we can help you on at any point. Today's session, we recognize, will probably be a lot of information that you'll want to take in. Hope you'll have questions today, but might want to stew on it. So next Tuesday at 10:30, you should have received a link if you were interested to join an admin ops water cooler chat. This is an hour session where we have no agenda. It is for you to come and speak with your fellow admin ops, district managers, district staff, those who want to log in and really ask those pressing questions. Was there something from today you wanted to follow up on? Is there just some other issue, VRS changes, anything that you want to really have an open forum to discuss? So make sure you have that one on your calendar also. Next Tuesday at 10:30. On July 10th at 2 o'clock is an Excel training. Rachel Duvall in our office is an Excel guru and has pulled together a really great agenda for some not basics, but a little bit of tips and tricks that would be a great refresher if you're comfortable with Excel, or really give you some insider scoop to be working more efficiently with Excel. So July 10th, 2 to 3. And then on July 23rd, Tuesday at 2 p.m., we have scheduled a 1-hour session with the local government investment pool. Many of you who joined the training session for admin ops committee work back in March, April timeframe really may remember discussing this one with Gordon and how it was relevant in the desktop fiscal guide that the Soil and Water Board approved. Some of you are utilizing it, but the number of folks from Treasury have decided to join us to speak to that opportunity and really give you a little bit more information about LGIP. So make sure you have all of those on your calendar. They've been going out all district also, but wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page. With that, though, I really want us to get into some weeds with Patrick about FLSA and questions that you had been asking me directly that I knew we needed to go get some additional resources for. So I'm going to start screen sharing. Patrick, thank you so much for being with us again today. You've been a wealth of resources for our districts, and we're really thankful. Can you see my screen, your slides?
Yep.
Awesome.
That looks good. Good morning, everyone. Again, Patrick Teague. I am the HR director for James City County and the Williamsburg Historic Triangle. And one of the topics that Kendall provided me that was of interest to some folks is the Fair Labor Standards Act changes that are coming up, have already occurred this year, and then also as we transition into 2025. So let's look at our agenda on our next slide. And so this is the Code of Federal Regulation, the easiest place you can find if you're a script person and you want to read the original text. So we'll roughly cover what that says, and then we'll move into the exemptions that are available from the Fair Labor Standards Act. Then we'll look at the salary test component and the changes that occurred this year and into next year. and then the ever difficult duties test, and then really where you should be utilizing FLSA in creating your jobs and identifying your folks for either exemptions or entitlement to overtime protections. So let's jump into the text on the next slide. And reading it to you, employees are exempt from FLSA's minimum wage and overtime if they're employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity as they're defined in the regulation. To fall in there, an employee must meet 3 tests. They have to be paid salary. So if you have a temporary or on-call person and you're paying them for the hours worked, there's no reason they're ever going to be exempt. Those folks should qualify for overtime. And the next is be paid at least a specified weekly salary level, and the duties performed, executive, administrative, or professional, as provided in the regulation. And let's move on to the next. So looking at the salary test, as of July of this year, it will move up to 43,888 as an annual salary, or 844. And then in January, it'll move up to 58,656. What this means is if the person makes less than these amounts, either by week or by annual, there doesn't matter what their job is, they have to qualify for overtime. Your highly compensated employees now have moved up to 132,964, and in January it's expected to move to 151,164. And then after that, every 3 years, beginning in 2027, they're going to look to see if adjustments need to be made. So again, if a position doesn't meet a salary test, you don't need to continue any further in your analysis. And we'll go to the next.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Patrick, there was a question I got directly. Can you
Oh, yeah, and I
discuss?
did mean to mention, Kendall, to everyone listening, when we're on a slide, if you have a question about that slide, please ask now. That way we don't have to back up the slide, and there may be other folks who have the same question.
Or I got one in the chat box and also one directly. Can you explain the difference between what's a highly compensated employee?
Yeah, so that's going to be covered under the duties test. The only thing you need to understand on this slide is what the salary levels are, and if they're not met, there's no reason to continue.
Brittany, feel free to come off mute if you want and ask. I think I understand. Somebody wrote in the chat. Brittany wrote in the chat. Does this mean that someone making more than 151,164 would not be non-exempt or could not be non-exempt?
They could still be non-exempt and eligible for overtime. You would move on to the duties test after this. So the components really are salary. If that's met, move to duties. Those are the 2 steps you have to make.
I think I got all the questions in the chat box, but I'll advance. But now's your chance if you have questions regarding this to come off mute, step up and ask.
Yeah, it's usually the duties section where most of the questions are. So let's look at the categories of exemptions and how the duty test works. So as an executive, if you want an executive exemption, their primary duty is management of the enterprise and customarily recognized as a department or a subdivision. So you have to be at a high level within an organizational chart to qualify for executive. And customarily and regularly, they direct the work of 2 or more folks, and they have the authority to hire, fire, or the suggestions have particular weight. So like number 4 is where things might get a little gray for folks. And let's stop for questions on executive.
So yes, to Sarah's question in the chat box, certainly can provide the slides to everybody who registered as well as the recording of this afterwards. I think I've got two questions. Where can we get a salary test? And what about a combination of administrative and executive duties? The employee does not manage two or more employees.
Let's back up to the question, which was, where do you find a salary test? The previous slide is your salary test. So you just need to sit down with a piece of paper and figure out if your weekly employee is making more than that amount, or if your annual salaried employee is making more than that amount. There's no, if you were to create a form to make that happen, it would simply be, what is the salary? The threshold is this. Check yes or no if it qualifies. And there was a second part to that question, Kendall.
Sure. What about a combination of administrative and executive duties? The employee does not manage two or more employees. So Keith, feel free to elaborate if needed.
Well, what I'm thinking about is where part of an employee's duties, they're managing a program, they're not managing two or more employees. They meet the salary threshold, and I'm a little bit leery to say this employee is executive or administrative, but they have some of both responsibilities.
We'll keep the first question when we're under executive is, do they make, for example, in January, 151,000 a year?
No.
Right, so then we're done. You start every one of these with the salary test. If they don't meet the salary test, then that's not the right category to look at. And we'll cover all the other categories so you can get an idea of where that position might fit. But an executive is really going to be an executive director, head of a division. They're going to have layers and layers typically underneath them, or the one and only, and they meet the salary test. And
So
they regularly direct two or more folks.
So are you saying executive has to meet the high threshold?
Executive has the primary duty is management of an enterprise. When we think about an enterprise, that typically would be something that affects the general population of your service area. So, for example, the director of planning for a locality might meet the executive test because their work affects everyone living in that county, but the salary would have to be met first before you even considered that category. Again, executive is just, if I wanted to determine for my staff, first thing I would look at is salary for everybody. If they're under the salary threshold, you don't even need to look at anything else. You just put them as non-exempt. Everyone else may fit one of these categories, and we'll go over each one. Executive is one of the harder ones to match because there aren't typically lots and lots of executives under one employer. It's typically your CEO or your deputy or chief financial, that type of thing.
Right. So I guess my question is, a lot of us are district managers, and everything is under our purview, I'm going to say. So do we fall under the current, are we considered the $150,000, whatever that figure is, salary to be exempt under executive?
Correct.
Or do we? Okay.
And then we would move you, if you don't match that salary, we will go over the other categories where you might fit.
Okay. That's something I did not understand previously. So thank you.
No, great question.
I think you have some other questions that were related to Keith's in the chat box, but I don't want to assume that you've answered them. So let's see if Brittany, you want to come off and ensure that you've got clarification on any of the executive duties.
Thanks. I think maybe it's been answered. So it sounds like if somebody does not meet and I'm thinking specifically of a district manager as well, where ignoring number one, and I know number one is the first thing, but you know, they may meet the duties test for 2, 3, or 4. Would they also have to meet for the salary tests? Would they have to meet the highly compensated employee to be considered an executive? Am I understanding that correctly?
Those are actually two different categories. You're correct. The highly compensated, let's go back to the salary test again. Yeah, so what you're gonna find here is most exemptions, that's gonna be your professional categories. Again, we're gonna cover all that, which ones exist under these most exceptions. It's the highly compensated is the executive, so let's skip down. So again, it's a category with its own requirement, separate from all the other categories. Executive stands out under highly compensated, if that makes
Okay, so if you have somebody that their duties, say a district manager, include 2, 3, or 4, but they fall somewhere between, they fall above the standard salary level, but below highly compensated, they're still exempt, they're just not considered an executive.
exactly.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
And let's skip past executive to the next one, and I think it'll become more clear. So the administrative, again, same salary test. This is where a lot of folks are gonna fall if they don't manage 2 or more folks. But what they're doing here is non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer. That describes a whole lot of different levels of positions. And it's an exercise of discretion, independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. So your folks who don't manage 2 or more are going to fall under this category.
Patrick, I think what's getting everyone like under executive, administrative, the highly compensated. So on executive, you have district managers that manage employees. They meet that executive standard. We are subdivision districts. So I think what's getting everyone is the highly compensated.
I got
So what salary test, when you talk about executive, administrative, meets the salary test of the not highly compensated?
Okay, yeah, I think I got it, and I think I did kind of
Mhm.
single all my words together to confuse you. So let's back to the salary section. So this exception is going to be, in fact, for your executive, for your administrative, for your computer professionals, for your teachers, for your lawyers. All of the other categories are going to fall under here. A highly compensated person is just a highly compensated person. And that should have just, this is how much they make, doesn't matter what their duties are.
That makes sense. Okay, got it. Thank you.
And
Yeah,
are the weekly, the amounts per week are the same for both standard salary and highly compensated?
that might be a typo on my part. I'll need to double check that. Let me make a note, and if that is a correction, I'll let you know. But I pretty much took this straight from the update on the website, so I think it's correct. But I'll double check that. Are there other questions? Let's get back to the administrative. So questions on this, typically what I've seen come up is, how do you define exercise of discretion and independent judgment? How I would answer that is there a manual or an individual at a higher level that provides that kind of general direction on day-to-day activity? If there is, then there's not as much discretion or independent judgment. But if you've got an employee in administrative capacity described above that doesn't have a manual, that does perhaps have some standard operating procedures, but when something new comes along, they get to use independent judgment on where to put that and how to deal with it, as opposed to, Anything that isn't covered in the manual, they go to their boss and ask, what do I do with this? So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if there are questions and we'll move on to the next one. So here's another place where you might find your folks who don't supervise 2 or more people. And that's one requiring an advanced type in a field of science, customarily acquired by prolonged specialized intellectual instruction. Or it becomes more artistic, requiring invention, imagination, talent in field of art or creative endeavor. And this is where you find your folks like teachers, lawyers, folks who have to have a master's degree, for example, in our line of work. Those are folks who have to get a master's in social work to provide child protective services. So anything that requires a lengthy specialized instruction is going to fall in this category. I don't see any new questions coming through, so let's pop to the next. And computer employees. Basically, I'm not going to read this to you, but this one is your software and your hardware people, or a combination of software and hardware. But they have to, that isn't your help desk person. This is going to be your person that you get new software and they have to find a way to integrate it with one of your existing systems. That's actually software application writing. Same thing with the hardware portion of it. It isn't just plugging in computers. This is really, you're working with a mainframe and you're dealing with more system connection issues. And we'll skip to the next one. And they give some more here. So obviously your video game designers, those types of folks fall in here. And then it's the combination of those 3 bullets at the bottom where you might have a hybrid position, but it does some higher level computer work as described before. And let's flip to the next one. And I don't know if anybody has outside sales employees, but they have all their own category, but typically I don't find that in government offices. So let's skip to the next slide. So what does this mean to you once you've figured out whether someone should be exempt or non-exempt? Exempt employee works over 40 hours in a week without any type of expected or required compensation. The legal penalties really are for misclassifying employees, and it's from they've lost where you show the loss versus the other direction is they would have received more money. Typically, if you're putting someone as non-exempt and they're exempt, they haven't lost anything. So there really is no legal course of action. So if you're in doubt, it is always best to err on the side of making the person overtime eligible. And the best place you want to put this is in a job description. So it's clear up front, because that's one of the working conditions when you hire someone is what is their expected pay. If you don't have that somewhere for them to see, they will not know if they're eligible for overtime or not, how they're paid. That will tell you, hey, if you tell me my position is exempt, then I know that I'm getting paid the same amount every week, regardless of the hours I work. So let's pop into general questions, and we can definitely go back and review anything that might be missing.
I think I can clarify one of the earlier questions, Patrick. You're right. We had talked about this too. The salary threshold, when someone asked the question, is it the same for per week for highly compensated? Yes, it is. It is really just setting the minimum of what they can make each week. So clearly they're going to make more annually, but they can't make less than that amount per week.
Thank you. That's perfect.
Sherry, feel free to come off mute if you want. I might have missed other questions too. She asked if someone is exempt and make over 40 hours, can someone still earn comp time?
Yes, but it depends on your written policy. So typically you're going to have a policy that says exempt folks who are not eligible for overtime may meet a standard number of hours to work where they receive comp time. But it is never hour for hour. Otherwise, you are creating the impression that that position technically could be eligible for overtime. And what I mean by that is, it's the idea of if you treat it that way, then it probably is what you're treating it as. So if every hour over 40, you get that amount of vacation, you're essentially paying them overtime, even though it's not cash. So you probably misclassified the person, because otherwise, if I work a couple hours over today and work a couple hours over tomorrow, it's only 44 hours. And you wouldn't expect that that would be compensated any more than if I left an hour early.
Sherry, does that help?
I have a question. So if they work 4 extra hours, I'm not clear on what you're trying to say. If they work 4 extra hours, what should they be given? An hour? A quarter of the time? They should be given, if it's not equal, what's the trade-off? I don't understand.
You either write a policy or you make an executive level decision, which is typically when I've been in those situations where somebody has really put in a ton of hours. Let's say we're launching to do software and they put in 10 hours a day for 2 weeks. I might give them, but I'll actually put it as an incentive instead of an expectation. Meaning that I'll write them an incentive award that says, you put in all these extra hours, saved us so much time and energy. Here's 2 days of leave to recognize as a bonus. Bonuses make more sense for your exempt employees than trying to do hour for hour. So again, what I'm saying is, if it walks and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. If you start treating your job like it's eligible for overtime or comp time, you're eventually going to run into problems, because they can say, I'm misclassified. Why else would they be paying me hour for hour with comp time?
What if you had in your policy a flex time policy, so that if an exempt person works over an hour one day, then maybe they can take an hour leave the next day?
Yeah, you can definitely have that. And again, that writes it in policy. That's where you're saving yourself from that question, is it a duck? Because in your policy, you say, no, we know that this position's not eligible for overtime, but we want them to have a work-life balance, so we're going to allow them to flex.
Okay.
Yeah, anytime you create a policy, as long as it's legally sound, it's clearly indicating your intentions about what you're doing.
And my next question goes back to some duty statements. So a lot of district employees have conservation specialists, and they do have to make some decisions when they're designing a practice or working with a client. They do have to take a prolonged training. It's not a master's degree, but it's several different training programs. So how do we determine if that meets one of these, this advanced type of knowledge? I think that's a lot of districts have trouble deciding that.
I would be less inclined to look at that exemption category, because it doesn't have an extended intellectual training. You know, in my job, you can get bunches of certifications and all kinds of stuff. You can get certificates in human resources, etc. But a master's in human resources is going to show that prolonged intellectual study versus a certificate or a training program here and there. I would look at the administrative for that position. Because are they just following a manual with their day-to-day work? Is what they're doing essential? If we can go back, Kendall, real quick, look at administrative. That can be one of the easiest categories for you to slot someone in. I think it's that one, yeah. So it's office or, and again, I don't know the jobs that well, but you would have to look past the executive, we go to administrative.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so the thing you have to watch in this one is it's office or non-manual work. So if a big part of what they're doing is digging holes and trenches and rehabbing landscapes, that's going to be manual work. It's the management of general business operations where that might fall in to what you're describing. But typically it's not going to fall into the professional exemption unless it's a clear past 4-year degree, intellectual or artistic type of program.
Thank you. That clarifies that.
And I did remember a question right when we kicked off about, excuse me, a duty sheet basically, or a cheat sheet to go through and determine these tests. They are out there, but if you're going to use one, you should probably have an attorney review and sign off on it before you do. Because if that's in an employee file and you're incorrect, it's going to be on you, not because you took it from University of California, Davis or something. They're not going to be able to back you up on that interpretation. So unless it's coming from some sort of DHRM, et cetera, where you've got an umbrella to protect you, I don't recommend trying to create a sheet and keeping it on file. You can definitely use what's out there. It will make sense, but I would not retain that as how I made that determination. I would make it based on the job description, say, clearly this job description shows this is an exempt employee.
Stop sharing for a minute. I think, Siobhan, did you have a question still you wanted to?
Yes, thank you. Patrick, so I have two similar job titles. My conservation planners are, I would say, fairly equal in their job duties. But with these new thresholds, I would say one is under the threshold and one is over the threshold. So I guess I just wanted to hear from your mouth that one would be exempt and one would not be, even though their job description and title is the same.
Actually, the quick response on that is it's exactly the opposite of everything you just said. They're either both non-exempt or they're both exempt because they're both doing the same job. Salary test is for a position. For example, if a lot of our positions will have some people start at the bottom, some people after 10 years will come in the middle. It's really what is the minimum salary of that job? Because if you try to classify one job one way based on this person's salary and another, then that job's not exempt. Both jobs should be non-exempt because the salary test also is followed by a duties test. So just because you meet a salary doesn't mean you meet the duty. And if you do meet the duty and the salary, that's the job, not the person in it.
Okay, so these are job exemptions, not whether a person is exempt or not.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, to keep yourself in clear, non-legal trouble, It's the job description that determines exempt and non-exempt. So you look at the duties, you do all that, you make that determination. But you also have to look at the salary, because if you're not paying the minimum for that job, then that cannot be an exempt position. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just have to think about it more. Sorry, that is throwing me for a loop, but I'll just sit on it for a minute.
Yeah, no, probably the easiest thing I can tell you for it not to spin is exempt or non-exempt is a job classification, not a person classification. So if
Patrick,
the job cannot guarantee to pay above a minimum amount, it probably should not be exempt.
so can I clarify that with something Kathy said, which I think is what you're saying too? A position can be exempt, but the employee performing the job can be non-exempt if they don't meet the salary threshold.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it. But you really, again, shouldn't have one being exempt and one not, because it questions why you're paying so little for an exempt position. The rule change really is trying to push wages up, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so, I mean,
Time or pay people more.
that makes sense to me. I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, I would have to go to my board and say, I don't know what I would say. I don't know how to present this as information to.
It's
They-
confusing to
yeah.
me.
It's the same position, but one person has been here longer.
Yeah.
They have maybe a little more responsibility, but.
Yeah.
I don't
So,
know.
yeah, this happened before when we had it changed the salary threshold and we went back and forth. And it was almost like you have to, if you have a conservation specialist, you're looking at their job duties and all of that. It's like we brought our conservation specialist salary up to the minimum threshold. So whoever we hire, they're going to start at that minimum threshold because the duties match. So we had to go back and change our conservation specialist, which was good for him because, he got a raise to get him at that minimum level. And anybody we hired in that position started at that minimum threshold. So you may have to go back to your board and let them know if this is the duties of your conservation specialist, to make them exempt, you have to change your salary. Either one, like you got to do one or the other, or they're gonna, be non-exempt. But that's how I think a lot of districts handled it when we had that change before. And I think I don't know if Blair is on here, but it seems like DCR kind of did that as well with their CDCs at that time. They changed the salary.
No, thank you, Kathleen, for being a Patrick whisperer. That's exactly what I was trying to say. Yeah, because otherwise you budget for overtime. You make them non-exempt because they don't pay at the minimum, and then you budget for your overtime that you're gonna need. You gotta pay it somewhere.
Go ahead, Linda. Did I interrupt someone? I'm sorry. I do
And I
know
think
we
Kendall's a couple of questions in there about
perfect.
exempt employees and overtime.
Yeah, let's go back to the chat box then. And I think I've captured some. Terry, I think we've talked a little bit about your question. Our policy states that salaried staff receives comp time over 8 hours a day, and the comp time is calculated at time and a half. Is that correct or an incorrect policy?
The only thing is it's not a daily calculation. Typically, it's a weekly calculation. So it's hours worked over 40, not 8 hours worked in a day. That's why you can have 4 10s.
Great point. Sharon, did you want to ask or comment on your base salary?
Oh, I was just saying, anytime there's a change to FLSA, we change our base salary. And then we also use that as a compression increase. So when we change our base salary, which is our entry level salary for that position, to keep it exempt, we also give the benefit of that base salary increase to all employees, which prevents compression for those
Sure,
that
that's a-
board.
Yeah, that's a great way to present it to the board too. And I think that's a lot of what Kathleen was getting to. Kathy, did you want to speak to, can a government agency opt to award exempt employees with comp time at the rate of 1.5 hours for hours worked?
I wouldn't treat the position like it's eligible for time and a half. Maybe at 1 hour for every 2 hours, something. The safest way you can do this is to create an incentive policy. And when your folks work a lot of hours over 40 as exempt, you can reward them for something that doesn't change the definition of them being exempt. But anything that remotely resembles time and a half overtime is sure going to make that look like it should be non-exempt.
I might have missed a few questions in the chat box. Please feel free to just come off and ask your questions directly to Patrick.
Not to try to complicate things, but the county does my payroll and they like to review my job descriptions, and they have repeatedly told me that none of my staff are exempt. I've reviewed and reviewed and reviewed what everybody does, and that's a hard no, with the exception of myself. And so I don't really think it matters, but I do think it's interesting how many districts, their conservation technical staff are exempt and maybe always have been, and there's no issue and they can justify it. And I'm having a hard time with HR professionals. That's who I'm working with. HR professionals, and perhaps it's them not understanding the job. Our jobs are complicated. And they aren't here in my office seeing the work that's done, even though I've tried to explain it. So I just want to point that out. I don't mind being different than my peers, but and it is what it is. But I've had a hard time convincing my HR staff otherwise, and my staff don't mind because they get overtime. But I do think that that it's interesting. The other thing that it creates is, I have good salaries that are comparable to other staff, but yet they're also getting overtime. So it's almost like they're, I don't say being double compensated, don't get me wrong, but everybody keeps wanting to drive the salaries up and be competitive. And when my staff look at other staff salaries, they get that plus the overtime. And so I just wanted to share that. I don't know if other districts would be in a similar situation where an outside entity or group may be guiding them or capping them for exemption purposes.
I imagine, Megan, that's fairly confusing, not speaking from a district perspective, but from an HR perspective. But my gut tells me that if they don't know the job very well, or it doesn't make sense to them, they're choosing the safest route possible. And that's always going to be overtime eligible, non-exempt.
Patrick, this is Willie. I find this discussion very interesting. And what bothers me at the moment is it illegal to compensate your exempt staff an hour for an hour?
No, It's not illegal at all. All I'm indicating is somewhere down the road that can come back to haunt you if you're treating it like it's overtime eligible, but you're saying it's not overtime eligible.
And what is,
Even hour for hour gets awfully close, because what we're saying is, I'm gonna give you a salary guaranteed, but you may have to work 50 hours one week, 35 the next, 45 another week. You need to work till the job's done. That's the benefit of having a predetermined amount that's over a salary threshold. So no, if you do hour for hour or such like that, flex time, all of that is perfectly good, but you definitely never want to do a compensation for over 40 hours that looks close to overtime. So that would be 1.5 for every hour.
and so one more guidance that we probably can get from this meeting is whatever we decide to do, we should make sure it's in our employee manual or policy book, right? So that would be your justification for doing whatever the district is doing.
Yeah, at least that gives some clear indication that you have thought this out and this is a policy versus trying to avoid paying overtime.
Mhm. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I encourage anyone to look at bonus or incentive separate programs that reward people for great work or immense amounts of productivity that are outside the norm, which may include last 2 weeks, you worked 20 extra hours. I'm going to give you an incentive award of 3 days of vacation or a certain amount of money. You saved our district $3,000, so 10% of that is 300. If you treat it like a bonus, because think of a private company, and sales is the perfect one. We didn't look at the sales exemption, but if you notice, a lot of those high-level salespeople and executives get bonuses every year. That doesn't make them look overtime eligible. They're not getting $1 for $1 or $1.50 for $1, but they are getting a bonus for their overall performance. And that's how you can treat exempt folks when they put in a lot more hours than the regular 40.
Got a couple more questions on the chat box. Sherry, I don't know that this is related, but Patrick, she asks, if exempt, does that mean staff should not be accruing annual leave or sick leave?
That's kind of two different topics. We're talking about anybody who's working over the 40 hours in a week. And should we be giving them something if they're exempt? What you have in your benefit package for sick leave, vacation, that's the same for everybody, has nothing to do whether you work overtime or not.
If a technical position requires a college degree in a science-based field, does that qualify for the learned professional exemption?
A bachelor's, if you noticed, and the best part, if you ever go to the website, they have FAQs and videos, and they actually talk through real life examples with you. It's one of the FLSA site is one of the better sites for non-HR people because they have so much material presented in different ways. But generally speaking, can you repeat that for me, Kendall?
Sure. If a technical position requires a college degree in a science-based field, does that qualify for the learned professional exemption?
It would be close. Obviously, when they say extended, they generally are looking at 4 more years, 4 or more. A master's degree is the 6th. That's the easiest. That's where you're looking at a Juris Doctorate. You're looking at advanced medical. Those fields, that's a 2 to 3 or 4 year study past your bachelor's. That's the safest interpretation. So I would say, I would look at the other duties within that exemption professional, because also it's non-manual. And it also has to be of the primary business of the enterprise. So you're gonna wanna look at those pieces as well. I would, again, err in caution to always say, well, how about that plus a 1-year certificate study in a specialized part of that field?
So
And
I actually think that might get to the next question that I had directly sent to me.
Yeah,
That, right, not just the college degree, but they have to have a conservation planner certification. So,
how
if,
long does
right,
that take?
well, it could
to-
take a year.
a
Okay,
year?
you get it through DCR, might need conservation planner credentials to do the technical position. Would that qualify for the professional
And,
exemption?
and again, without a job description, I'm never gonna tell you a black and white answer, but what I will tell you is that would definitely be worth taking a closer look at. I think it very much could fall into that category. Or the administrative, that's usually the broadest category, depending on how much is field work versus office work.
Other questions related to that one?
And this is Keith, I guess, and that was kind of my original question, Patrick, was if you've got somebody that's kind of, some of their job is in that learned professional that you were just talking about it and administrative duties, they may not meet all for either one of them, but can a combination of responsibilities be used to pass that test?
I think there's enough within either category to use some of the material from another category, but no, there's no, as far as I know, there's no a la carte version where you can pick things from different categories, fit it all together and make a Frankenstein out of it. I think what you have to do is focus on one of those and define it. And the biggest part of what you're going to do with that is, I know all of you have these conservation positions, it sounds like, but I'd be curious how many of your job descriptions are exactly the same? And I don't know if that's a Kindle question. But yeah, that to me would be my greatest concern about those positions right away is how different is one district for another and why? Because shouldn't they be somewhat comparable?
No.
Okay, and that's
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, they're all going to be different. Some people have a staff of 15, some people have a staff of 2, and they, combination, and all districts are different subdivisions. We all have our own tax ID, everybody's different. So you're not going to find the similar job descriptions, but I don't think they're ever going to be all the same.
Kathleen, his question wasn't, are they all the same? It was, shouldn't they be all the same? Which
Right, and it's the
is
same answer is no. Because it's not possible. If I have a staff of, it's 3 of us, and we don't have a separate education coordinator. Some districts have a separate education coordinator, then other districts, may have 5 conservation specialists, and we have 1 that may be doing urban and, you know what I'm saying? So yeah. It's just not possible.
Me a lot because obviously I don't have that level of detail. A good way to think of this also is job titles do not determine anything to do with exempt or non-exempt. Job titles are, you do want it to match, of course. You don't want it to sound like a non-exempt job if it's exempt because it'll confuse people. But at the end of the day, nobody cares what you call it. It's what are the duties. And so if the duties can be that dramatic where you're combining 3 positions, yeah, that one might be exempt and another one might not be.
I think Sherry has a question, and then Jean Presley.
Yeah, okay, so
Jeannie?
let me get into those for you. So Sherry, I think this is a good example for a lot of us, and a lot of districts will send staff, for example, to the association's youth conservation camp to serve as camp counselors for a week-long conservation camp at Virginia Tech in July. And Sherry's district compensates their staff for not only an 8-hour day, but for an additional 8 hours because they have a supervisory role until campers go to sleep. They're, for that entire week of being a camp counselor, on the clock in some ways, right? You kind of sleep with one eye open. You help at whatever hour of the day it's required to ensure our campers are safe. It only occurs for this district necessarily 2 times a year because they might have their own district camp too. It sounds like overtime, Sherry, is their reward. So how would you compensate someone who's serving in that counselor role for a week where they're gone Saturday to Sunday and in charge of 50 to 60 counselors? I mean, campers.
So I'm assuming they're currently exempt. And so I think what you're doing is exactly a great way to recognize that extra effort. And if it's a practice, preferably a policy where you have it in writing, this is part of your job, it's going to happen every week. And here's how we're going to make up for the fact that it's a whole lot more than you're used to having to do. That I think the way you're handling it is perfect as long as it's in writing.
Sherry, does that help?
Yes and no, because I guess I get disheveled a little bit about the identifying exempt and non-exempt. So exempt is they do not get minimum wage or overtime. Most of the employees that we have are non-exempt because they only meet the one criteria of being the specialty or the education coordinator. So that's why, and we have it written up in our policy that they understand that they're non-exempt and that they will earn overtime. So it's in our policy that they know that.
Yeah.
So I guess I've been a little confused because like I don't try to work overtime no more than I have to because my time is valuable. But there have been times as an exempt person, I have been given overtime because of something out of my control on a Friday afternoon with somebody coming into the office. And I think I do have something, I don't have it in front of me, but again, there's a contract we signed with our board that said that in certain circumstances, I would still get overtime because there's no way for me to take that time off. That's my reward. I mean, rewards are good and bonuses are good, but you're still going to take taxes out of it. So, I mean, that's all. I don't know.
Yeah, Sherry, I think I'm following you. It's, again, back to what is in writing. Your board has provided you in writing clearly the conditions of your employment, that although you're exempt, there are certain situations they're going to reward you for extra hours. That's great. It just can't be every time you work extra hours because you do need to be able to work more than 40 hours without extra pay.
So this one I hope should be an easy one for you, Patrick. So any employee earning less than 43,888 as of July 1st or 58,656 as of January 1st are eligible for overtime.
Yeah. Yeah, they need to be flipped at that point because if you don't meet the salary, nothing else matters.
I think I've tried to capture most in the chat box. I know it's right at the top of the hour. This is your chance to come off mute and ask any final questions. So if I think I saw somebody just drop one in, feel free to just come off mute and take your last chance to ask questions to Patrick. We'll ask him to stay.
I have a question. This is Heather Shackley. So this, I feel like we're belaboring this, but I think it's because it's confusing to me and to everyone. We have 2 employees, myself is one of them, who work 1,560 to 1,600 hours a year. So we are 75 and 80% full-time equivalent, but we are classified as full-time by policy. We are salaried, we are benefited. And so does that change? And I do work overtime. I do work more than 32 hours a week on a regular basis. And I take that hour for hour as comp time. It doesn't happen all the time. It's during busy periods. But does the fact that my standard hours are less than 40 hours a week change any part of this equation? The other employee, I believe, based on his credentials and training, would be considered professional, exempt professional. We both match the salary threshold. Does that change anything?
It shouldn't. You can be a quasi full-time employee by contract. Again, if you're meeting the salary piece, then you match the duty test, you would still have to work over your 40 hours unless by contract, they said your quasi full-time is going to be treated as 40 hours and you'll be eligible for blah and blah afterwards. But otherwise, there are hourly requirements to determine when overtime kicks in for a non-exempt employee.
Okay, and the way we clearly have some work to do on this, but the way we've treated it is any hours over 32, I can use as comp time at a later time.
Yeah, and that's fairly standard from what I've seen on quasi full-time, but here's the secret about me. I'm not a payroll specialist and I never was. So I have never calculated overtime for someone.
Mm-hmm.
I rely on my payroll department for that expertise. I know how to interpret the rule, but I don't necessarily know how to give you the right paycheck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think paying overtime to anyone who is full-time and is a part of the retirement system is a complicated endeavor that strikes fear in my heart. I don't know about everybody else, but especially with the VRS rate separation going on, where it's just it makes overtime pay a lot more complicated. So
yeah, and they will do payroll audits to see if any of the salary that's being submitted is not actually eligible based on the rule.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
When comp time is earned, is there a time limit that number of hours has to be used? And if we are exempt, can the board refuse to pay overtime? So Elizabeth, feel free to come off and ask further.
I was just curious if, once we earn the comp time, the limit on when those comp time hours can be used. And also, does the board have authority to say once I meet my 34 hours, I cannot get overtime? I just have to go home, or how does that work?
Is your position exempt or non-exempt?
Oh, I'm exempt. I'm under the threshold.
Right, so no, they don't have to pay you anything for any hours worked over your normal schedule. And as far as comp time goes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I am not exempt. I am under. Sorry.
So again, if you're not full-time, it would depend on what your employment agreement was as a quasi full-time employee, which I'm assuming you are. But yeah, if you're non-exempt, any hours worked over 40 is the actual law.
Okay.
But I want to go back to your first question. Can you remind me what that was? It was the comp time. With comp time, I am not sure if there is any federal or state or local code that says you have to pay comp time after a certain point. What I do know is there is no use it or lose it with comp time. Comp time is considered very much like your overtime compensation, time and a half. So if you have comp time on the book, they can make you take a payout for it, but they can't just ignore it. You either have to be paid for it out at some point, or you need to be able to use it.
Okay, thank you.
Patrick, is it perfectly fine then to say that you've earned that comp time, you have to use the comp time within the next 60 days?
Yeah, that's what we do. And so what our policy says is you can carry your comp time for 2 years and you will lose it if you don't use it by then.
Guys, this has been really a great conversational session, which is what we'd hoped for it to be. We recognize this can be confusing, but certainly wanted to try to lay some groundwork for you to better understand. And certainly Patrick is a wealth of resources. I failed to mention he's the Director of Human Resources in James City County. So really in the weeds of this on the day-to-day and knows our district audience and is certainly trying to step out and help us in how we can improve our policies and our work in these laws that can sometimes be tricky for us. So thank you, Patrick, for giving of your time today. I will stay on the line a few minutes longer. We'll stop recording at this point in case you had any questions that you wanted to ask afterwards.
All right. Thank you, everybody.